Aggregate demand and aggregate supply, or we call it the ADAS model. Now, first, let's review our business cycle. I already discussed this last week. So when we say business cycle, this is the fluctuations in the economic activity. So this fluctuation here doesn't have any regular or predictable pattern, right, compared to the illustration. So I showed you the economic growth of the Philippines over time. So if you notice there, if you can still remember, the fluctuations are different every year. So the variable here in the business cycle is the aggregate output or our GDP, and then over time. Now our GDP is composed of a lot of other variables like consumption, spending, like government expenditures. So I'll talk further about that. So national income accounting. Now on this business cycle here, it has different portion. Now on our expansion stage from point A to peak, at this point here, it is expected that the economic growth is expanding or booming or increasing. Now when the economy is at its expansion, it is also expected that inflation rate rises. Now, from the peak to trough, this is where our economy is declining or started to decline, and we call it contraction or recession. Now, whenever there is a recession, unemployment rate is also expected to rise, and then inflation is decreasing. So, mo tong explain ako last week about stagflation, it is unnatural for the inflation to happen or inflation rate to increase if there's a decline in the GDP or economic growth. So muna ginabantayan sa mga economists and expert. Now the fluctuation here, this blue line, this is the movement of our economic growth in the short run. While this one, this straight line here, straight line is the long run trend of our economic growth, or what our economic growth should be. It should be upward sloping. Now this fluctuation here, the blue line fluctuation, can be explained by the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply, or we call it the ASAD model. So the ASAD model explains the short-run fluctuations in the economic activity around its long-run trend. So by the way, when we say short-run in macroeconomics, it refers to a period of time where prices change very little or slowly adjusting if there is changes in the economic phenomena. But when we say long run in macroeconomics, it is a period where prices are flexible no matter what is the economic phenomena. Okay, unlike sa micro, when we say short run in micro, at least one input is fixed, and then in long run sa micro, all inputs are variable. So that's the difference. Okay, so the ASAD model focuses on the behavior of two variables, which is the real GDP, or the measure of our economic output, and then the price level, which is the inflation rate, can be measured through CPI or the GDP deflator. Now, what is this AS and AD model? It's just simply a graph, right? As you see there, so we have the real GDP on x-axis. It's either real GDP, aggregate output, aggregate income. They're all the same. And then on the y-axis, we have the price level. So the price level here, this is the inflation rate. By the way, real GDP, this one, is corrected with inflation. All right, so the AD or aggregate demand, this one is downward sloping. It shows the quantity of goods and services that the household, firms, government, and the rest of the world want to buy at each price level. Since we are talking about macro lens. In micro, when we say demand curve, it's just the individual demand or a market demand. But in macro analysis, the aggregate demand talks about the demand of the household, the firms, the government, and the rest of the world. And the AS or the aggregate supply, this one, shows the quantity of goods and services that firms choose to produce at each price level. So that's the AS-AD model. So by the way, if you have any questions, just type it in on the chat box or any comments. All right, so let's talk about the aggregate demand first, or the AD curve. So as you see, the AD curve is downward sloping, meaning there's a inverse relationship between the price level and the real GDP, or our aggregate output or aggregate income. So our aggregate demand is affected by different components. So our aggregate demand is affected by the consumption spending, investment spending, government spending, and the difference between imports and export spending. So that's C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So what are these? So consumption, so it's the largest component of the aggregate demand. So for example, any consumptions is kaning wealth, wage increase. So anything na to use by the individuals to consume, like it, income, like income spending, wages, wealth, interest rates. So those are the components of our consumption. And then we have the investment spending. So another key component in our aggregate demand. So spending on either on machinery, equipment, new technology, buildings, or infrastructure by the firms. So investment can also be influenced by interest rates, all right, like future revenue, future profit. And then G is the government spending. So this one here is, we can say, an autonomous expending or expenditure. Autonomous meaning it doesn't depend on the income. Why? Because government spending is assumed to be controlled by the policymaker. So sila magbuot kung pilang igasto by the government. So depends on the national budget. And then our XM, our M here is the import spending. So these are the goods and services bought from abroad or from the rest of the world. So this one represents an outflow, meaning pagawas of funds from our domestic economy. So that's why it is negative here, meaning pagawas ang kwarta or ang demand. And then we have our X, which is export spending. These are goods and services we sold to the rest of the world or abroad. So this represents an inflow of funds into our domestic economy. So positive ni siya. But if we minus na tong export spending sa itong import spending, then we can come up with our net export, or the difference between spending on imports and receipt on exports. So this is also known as the balance of payments or the trade balance. So pag mag-equal na ang X ug ang M. So these four here are the components of our aggregate demand. So why is our aggregate demand curve is downward sloping? Okay, there are three reasons for that. First, we have the wealth effect, or ang nakasulat sa module, the real balance effect. This is the relationship or the interaction between the price level and the consumption. And then the interest rate effect, the interaction between price level and investment, and then the exchange rate effect or the foreign purchases effect, the interaction between the price level and the net export. So the reason why inverse ang relationship sa ato ang price level and real GDP. So what are these? So first is wealth effect or the real balance effect. All right, at this theory or this effect, diri ma-insert itong nominal and real value of money. So when we say nominal value, it is the face value of our money. Let's say you have 100 pesos now. So the face value of your 100 pesos is 100 ang yun. If you compare it to last year, 2020, ang real ang face value or nominal value sa imuhang 100 is also still 100. So that's nominal, the face value. But when we say the real value, ano siya, the real value of money, here it talks about the value of money corrected by inflation. So when we say you have 100 pesos now, what is its real value? So atong pangitaw ng inflation from last year to this year, and then atong kuhaon ang difference. Because your 100 pesos this year is different from the value of your 100 last year. That's because of your purchasing power. Ito yung sa itong mga mama na itong una daw, kung nakay 1,000 pesos, musulod ka groceryhan, imong 1,000 pesos, paggawas ni mo groceryhan, daghan na kay kagsilupin mabitbit. But now, kanang imong 1,000 pesos, musulod ka groceryhan, paggawas ni mo, isa or duha kasilupin na lang imong bitbit. That's because of inflation or ninggamay imong purchasing power sa imong money. That is the real value. Alright? So, kaning wealth effect concept is associated with the reality principle where what matters to people is the real value or purchasing power of the money, not its face value. So, maski hatagan ka 1,000 karon, imo siyang gastuon pagka next year pa, kanimong 1,000 mapalit karon, dili na pareha sa mapalit next year. So, that's the real value of the money. So, here how it affects our aggregate demand. So let's say when the price level decreases, so when the price level decreases, meaning na ay deflation, bakit kung price increase, inflation, price decrease, deflation. So if there's a price decrease in the economy, the real value of money will increase. Okay, so pag mutaas ang real value sa imong kwarta, consumer will feel that they are wealthier. Mas dako sila og kwarta nga ginagunitan. And then the feeling that they are wealthier, so they will encourage to spend more or consume more. So consumer spending or consumption spending will increase. That will increase our aggregate demand. So the relationship between the price level and the aggregate demand is inversely related because of this wealth effect or the real balance effect. So a decrease in the overall price will tend to increase the aggregate demand because of these reasons. So, muna siya ang wealth effect. Alright, next reason why AD curve is downward sloping is the interest rate effect or the interaction between the price level and investment. So, still, it's following the real and the nominal concept. So, let's say that the price level will decrease or there's deflation. So what happened? What will happen here? So when the price level will sorry. Dalira. Sorry. So if the price level will increase, so the real value of money that the consumer is holding, ilang ginagunitan na kwarta, will increase. So ang gamiton na nila to consume is just small amount of money. So napa sila is sobra na kwarta on hand. So ilang buhaton sa sobra na kwarta on hand, they will save it sa bank as savings or deposit sa bank. Now, in this assumption, those excess money that will be saved to the bank, it will increase the currencies in the bank. Now, pag daghan nag-deposits ang bank, it will tend to decrease the interest rate. Why? Because the supply of loans, which is katong mga deposited money, will also increase. So if the interest rate is low, it will encourage more firms to loan for money, and they will use it for investment. So the demand for investment will increase. Now remember katong components sa aggregate demand, one of the component is the investment spending. So if there's an increase in the investment spending, it will increase the aggregate demand. So that's how the interest rate effect explains why there's an inverse relationship between price level and the aggregate demand. Alright, so last is the exchange rate effect, or the interaction between the price level and the net export. So this is still related with the interest rate, since a lower price makes domestic goods cheaper relative to the foreign goods. So ano yun siya? So given earlier, as we decrease the price level, the interest rate will decrease, right? So here, if the price level will decrease, the domestic interest rate will also decrease. So what happens if the domestic interest rate will increase? So if the domestic interest rate will increase, so the domestic goods and services, their price will also decrease. So that will encourage foreign investors to invest in the domestic economy, and then that will also decrease the exchange rate. So if the economy has a very low exchange rate, then it will encourage export, meaning katong mga economy from the rest of the world will purchase goods and services in the domestic economy or sa Philippines, since mas cheaper ang atong goods and services. Now remember ganiha sa components atong aggregate demand, tong net export, tong X minus M, if the net export will increase, that will also increase our aggregate demand. So that's another explanation why there's an inverse relationship between the price level and the aggregate demand, the exchange rate effect. Alright, so our AD curve or aggregate demand curve will also shift either to the left or to the right. So what are the reasons that our AD curve will shift? Depends on the changes of these components. So katong si C, si I, si G, and si X minus M. So any changes of these components will either shift our AD curve to the right or to the left. So let's say sa consumption, the consumer is concerned about their retirement. So their demand for goods and services will decrease because they tend to save their money for future retirement, right? So if that's the case, then the aggregate demand will shift to the left because the consumption spending will decrease. So let's say if the investment spending will increase because businesses are predicting a positive business conditions, let's say a higher profit in the future. So firms will tend to invest more on facilities, infrastructure. So increase in investment will tend to move or shift our AD curve to the right. So these are the changes. And also money supply can help shift our AD curve. So if let's say the central bank will put more money on the circulation, meaning there's a lot of money to spend, so the purchasing power of the people will increase and then will shift our AD curve to the left, and then in reverse it will then shift to the right. I mean to the left, to the right, and then to the left. Okay, so any of these lang yun. But when we say there's a change in the price level, it's not a shift, ha? If a change in the price level, it's just a movement along the AD curve. Alright, so that's it for our aggregate demand curve. Again, for any questions, you can just type it in. We'll proceed with our aggregate supply or AS curve. So aggregate, saan to? So aggregate supply curve describes the relationship between the price level and the real GDP. So the aggregate supply has a positive relationship between prices, the level of prices, and the real GDP. However, in analyzing aggregate supply, we have to consider the short run and the long run effect. So we will discuss that. Okay, first is the short run aggregate supply or SRAS. Okay, again, our aggregate supply is an upward sloping, meaning that there's a positive relationship between the price level and our output. As our output increases, the price level will also increase. So in the short run aggregate supply curve, right? So if you have noticed, at point A and B, it should be relatively flat, and then it will slowly increase, then turns to sharply upward, like turning vertical at point C and D. Now at this point here, kaning point C and D, kani siya point C and D. At these points, the overall economy is using all its resources in producing output, meaning that we are, or the economy is at its capacity. When we say the economy is at its capacity, meaning that any changes in the price will not affect our aggregate output. Now in this flatter portion, kaning point A and B, at this point here, the economy is not fully utilizing its resources. What are these resources? Kaning labor, natural resources, technology. It means that the economy still have excess resources to use that they can develop, or the firms can develop, to produce more output. So at this point A and B, we are not yet in our full potential compared to point C and D that we are at full capacity. So why is upward sloping in YAS curve is upward sloping? So we have three reasons for that. We have the sticky wage theory, the sticky price theory, and the misperception theory. So sticky, when we say sticky in economics, it means that it has a slow or ano ba na siya? It is not adjusting that much if there is a change in the economic phenomena. Let's say a sticky wage, meaning if there is a changes in the wage increase or in the economic, sorry. So if there's a change in the wage or in the economic situation, that the labor supply will not respond immediately to that specific change. Alright, so sticky wage theory assumes that the wages are slow to adjust to the changing economic conditions, either because workers and firms signed a long-term contract or because wage setting conventions make it difficult. So here how it works. Now, how sticky wage theory explain why our AS curve is upward sloping? So let's say that there's an increase in the price level. Now, if there's an increase in the price level, meaning there is inflation. Now, if there is inflation, the real wage or the real salary will fall, will decrease. So going back atong nominal in real, meaning that the amount that the worker are getting will decrease because of the inflation. Let's say ang sweldo niya is 500 per day, but due to inflation, instead of 500 yun iyahang madawat, but the real value of that is maybe 400 na lang. So the real wage will fall. So ang mahitabo, if there's inflation and the real wage will fall, now the firm will assume that the labor is cheaper. Meaning barato naman siya due to inflation. So since ni barato na ang labor as assumed by the firms, so they will hire more labor. So pag mo hire kag more labor, as to what I showed you earlier, katong mga reasons why the AS curve will shift. So if there is an increase in labor, then the aggregate output will increase or shift to the right. So this is the reason why our price level and aggregate output has a positive relationship. So an increase in price level will increase the aggregate output due to these reasons. Alright, next reason why our AS curve is upward sloping, because of this sticky price theory. So sticky price theory emphasizes that prices of certain goods and services are slow to adjust in changing economic conditions. One of the reasons for this is, let's say, kaning menu of the firms, or let's say Jollibee. Ang menu sa Jollibee, they change it rarely lang yun, either 1 or 2 times in a year. Now, how they can adjust with inflation? So, these kind of firms, they have their own research and development department where they study and predict kung pila ang inflation rate for this specific year. Now, let's say the firm is expected an increase in the price level, or there's an inflation at the end of the year. So, ang buhatan sa firm, if they expected that there will be an inflation, now they will set the price of their goods and services higher. So pag set nila sa price, then katong mga other competitors or other firms will also follow with the price setting. So ang mahitabo, pag si Jollibee mo taas og price, then si McDo or si Chowking ba or si Mang Inasal will also increase their price. So it's either maybe they follow the same pricing ni Jollibee, or they have their own research and development team. Now, pag increase sa price with other competitors, ang mahitabo, the actual price of the goods and services will increase. Now, pag increase sa price, the firms as a price taker and as a profit maximizer, the firms will produce more output. So this is why there's a really positive relationship between the price level and the aggregate output in the sticky price theory. So as the expected increase in price level will also increase the aggregate output due to these reasons. Alright, last, the misperception theory. Now, this theory here is also based in the labor market, where individual firms may mistakenly believe that it is really just the price of their particular good that is rising. So how this theory works in confirming why our AS curve is upward sloping. So let's say that there's an inflation, a price increase. So the price level will increase, then the nominal wages will also increase. So ano siya? So let's say sa economy na inflation. So the employees will demand their employers siya, hey, nigtaas ng mga palitunon karon. We're also asking you guys to increase our salary, or there will be an wage increase. Di ba mo na ginakan kami sa mga nagka-protesta? A wage increase because of high inflation. So the firm will increase the nominal wages of the employee. Now, the thing here is when the firm increases the nominal wage, but the real wage will still be the same. Why? Because ang nominal wage, gi-correct man siya sa inflation, so ang real wage is the same lang as their wage before. So, bali ang nahitabo, the increase in their wages doesn't have any effect on their purchasing power. So, diha ni sulod ang misperception. Now, the employees or the workers will assume, or because of misperception, they think that their wages has been increased. So, ang nahitabo, so pag think sa workers nga ni-increase silang sweldo, na-motivate sila to work harder. So, they became more productive. So, the workers' productivity will increase due to the misperception. So, murag na-scam sila. So, abi nilang na-increase, motong nitrabaho sila o taman, they became more productive. So when they became more productive, oh, by the way, wrong ni siya. So they give more labor sa firm, and because of that, the firm will increase its output. So due to misperception, an increase in the price level will also increase the aggregate output. So the reason why our AS curve is upward sloping. Alright, so our shift, our short run aggregate supply curve will also shift either to the left or to the right due to these reasons. Changes in labor, change in capital, change in natural resources, or change in technology. So let's say the economy is adopting an older technology. So it is expected that the aggregate supply will shift to the left, or there's a decrease in output. But if the economy will provide more capital, then our aggregate supply will increase and shift to the right. So these are the changes. So kanilang yun ang mga reasons why SRAS curve will shift either to the left or to the right. Okay, so the equilibrium price level. So in the economy, the equilibrium price level may occur at the point where our AD and our AS curve will intersect. So at this point, here we can determine our national inflation rate at P0 and our aggregate output at Y0. So this is now our ASAD model. So this looks very simple, but this is one of the model that is being used in analyzing monetary and fiscal policy effect, okay, or other macroeconomic mga phenomena. Okay, so by the way, we also have our long run aggregate supply, or LRAS. Now here in the long run, going back, when we say long run, prices are flexible. Alright, so in the long run aggregate supply, the economy is using all its resources at full employment, meaning we are at our capacity. So no matter how much the price is or the price level is, our aggregate output would still be the same. So kaning long run aggregate supply is the point C and D of our short run aggregate supply curve. Kato ng vertical portion. So this is what will happen to our supply curve in the long run. Meaning masking na changes sa price, is it either an inflation or deflation, we can no longer expand our economy because we are at its capacity. Meaning nagamit na nato tanan nato labor, capital, natural resource, and technology. So we can no longer shift either to the left or to the right. Okay, so how can we use our AS and AD model? So we can use it in our monetary fiscal policy analysis. So just a recall. So when we say fiscal policy, it talks about government spending and changes in tax, and then monetary, the changes in money supply. And then when we say expansionary, the expansionary fiscal policy, it will boost or stimulate our economy. And then contractionary, it will slow down our economy. Alright, so let's say we have our AS and AD model here, and then the government will impose an expansionary fiscal policy. So what is the effect of this policy on our economy? So let's say we are at our flat portion of our AS curve, and then the government will impose expansionary fiscal policy. So it's either an increase in the government spending or a decrease in tax, expansionary man. So let's say G will increase. So an increase in the government spending will shift our AD curve to the right. So what will happen after a shift to the right of our AD curve? Aggregate output also increases from Y0 to Y1, so as our price level from P0 to P1. So both price level and output increases. However, the increase in the output is larger compared to the increase in the price level. So we can say imposing expansionary fiscal policy at this economic situation is effective, since economic growth is possible with a low inflation rate. So effective expansionary policy at this situation. Again, because there's a large growth in the economy and a small increase lang in the inflation rate. Now, let's say we are imposing expansionary fiscal policy where our AS curve is at its vertical portion. Now, what will happen? Let's say another increase in government spending like the Bayanihan Act. So that will increase our AD from AD0 to AD1, shift to the right. So both aggregate output and price level will also increase, but the difference is there's a large increase in the price level compared to an increase in the aggregate output, meaning as we increase our government spending, inflation rate increases at a higher level compared to an increase in our economic growth. So this one here reflects that the expansionary fiscal policy is not effective when the economy is at or when our aggregate supply is at the steep region or at its steeper region. So that's why it is important to know where the economy is standing before we impose any policy like the fiscal or monetary policy. So the government should do a research or consult economists or my economic managers on where we at before uh, building a policy that will help our economy, because that policy might have a negative or inverse effect on the growth or on the inflation.